So Robert isn't the only man in the novel to have sort of illusions of becoming a man through this experience of becoming a soldier. So his friend Clifford Purchase also carries a lot of these sort of dreams of glory and ideals of masculinity that he's been taught since they were children. And on page 53, there's some discussion about the books they're reading. So I'll just read you this passage. So of Robert's cabin mates, the only inactive one was Captain Ord. The second day out, he put on a pair of blue pajamas with white stitched anchors on the pockets and retired to his bunk. He claimed the privilege of having lost his voice and spent the voyage sitting propped up against his pillow, drinking brandy from a silver cup and reading the works of G.A. Henty. "What on earth are you reading that stuff for?" Clifford asked him. "God, I haven't seen those books since I was 12, he added. Ord said hoarsely that since he was going to do a boy's work, he must read the stuff of which boys are made, and smiled. Clifford didn't appreciate the humor. To him, the war was a deadly serious and heaven-sent chance to become a man. So we have two sort of opposing ideas of what it means to be a soldier for these two characters. Captain Ord sees this as being a kind of boys' work. This is what boys have been taught how to do to become soldiers. And there's some reference to the books of J.A. Henty. In an earlier passage, Robert, there's an allusion to Boy's Own Annual on page 51. And both of these references are kind of talking about kind of the popular adventure books that would have been part of every boy's life growing up at this time. So they would have read these adventure novels, these adventure stories, where they would learn pretty much how to become men. And these were stories that kind of taught you how to be tough and strong and heroic and courageous, and you'd look up to the men portrayed in the novels. So I just have some illustrations here of some cover art for Boy's Own Annual, and you can see the middle one is depicting a soldier. So this is an example of sort of the courage and valor that was attached to being a soldier that all these young generation of young men would have been raised reading novels of this type. So everyone has a sort of idea of what a soldier is, and it's an idealized version. So at this point, they haven't even seen warfare yet. So each man, each soldier has an idea of what they will be experiencing, but whether or not it lives up to this ideal is not yet shown. But it has a lot to do with how we socialize children in regards to their gender roles, and these are just some examples of ways that we teach gendered behavior through the stories that we tell to children. And Robert, again, is somebody who defies some of the gender conventions at the time. And Harris, his friend Harris, is another young man who doesn't quite fit the mold, the typical mold of the soldier. He's first described on page 54. So we learn a little bit about Harris. He's the young lad from Sydney, Nova Scotia. He's pale, and he always sort of chews on his pair of leather gloves. So Harris had bitten holes in the tops of the index fingers. He was an only child who'd never been away from home. His mother died when he was 3, and he lived estranged from his father, a silent man who owned a shipping yard where fishing boats were made. Harris stood for long hours gazing out of the porthole, wishing that he'd seen a whale. And he wears this scarf in a wistful shade of blue. So Harris is kind of fragile as well. He comes down with a cold, and it leads to pneumonia, and he spends pretty much the whole sea voyage in the infirmary, sick. And then Robert will also eventually bond with Harris, and they become very close. And Harris is the first man who was in charge of the horses in the cargo holder. And when he becomes ill, Robert takes his spot as the officer in charge of the horses. But the bond between Harris and Robert is one of the sort of central relationships of the novel as well. And Robert spends a lot of time with Harris. And both Robert and Harris are kind of more unconventional types of masculinity than what is sort of typically conveyed by that archetypal or idealized soldier figure that we all sort of maybe have in our head. They're both sensitive young men, and they are full of compassion. And Harris also has this fondness for animals. He talks about sea life in a way that is very sort of poetic, and he'll tell stories about swimming in the water with and all the sea life that's around him, and he feels at home there. So both Harris and Robert are men who are different and unique and special in their own way, and somewhat unconventional in regards to how the masculinity that was sort of popular at the time, which is very sort of tough and stereotypically manly, I guess. So these two young men were, a little more different or unconventional in that regard. So Robert takes over the cargo hold full of horses from Harris, and then it becomes a problem where one of the horses has become wounded, and Robert's duty is to shoot the horse and put it out of its misery. And he's never held a gun and shot something before, so this is another experience where his innocence is evident, and he is sort of faced with something that he can't fully understand or sort of take charge of. But we can sort of take some first sort of hear the descriptions of that cargo hold and how it sort of reiterates the chaos that was part of this experience of the ship. So page 30 or 55. Robert's first reaction when he saw the hold was one of horror, then of anger. Before you saw the hold, you heard it. The place was alive with flies. Robert wondered how Harris could have failed to do anything about them until he tried to do something about them himself. Very quickly he discovered that no one on the ship would cooperate. This included the ship's officers and crew as well as those with the CEF. There was hardly any light, and the scuppers were awash with sea bilge and urine. Manure was left where it fell for days on end. This is where the flies bred, thousands of them. There were rats as well, and the men on duty were forced to sit on the steps or high on the bales of hay. They all wore handkerchiefs across their noses and stayed, it seemed, as far away from the horses as they could get. So Robert is put in charge of this world of horses, and it describes how first he thinks it's, pretty much described as kind of chaos, hell on earth kind of thing, disgusting. And then he finds it kind of a refuge from the chaos of all the soldiers. Robert, as we know, has a sort of bond or affinity with animals and closely identifies with them, feels some sort of connection, spiritual or, I don't know, some other sort of bond that he feels with animals, a compassion that he feels for them. So it's revealed that he spent a good deal of time in the hold and oddly found it was a marvelous cure for seasickness. He became intrigued with this world of horses, rats, and bilge that had been consigned to his care. Robert soon became completely disengaged from the other life on the upper decks. He even went below off duty. So Robert sort of takes refuge in this world of animals, and it's kind of becomes a kind of escape for him. And there comes this moment when he has to sort of step up as the second lieutenant, and for the first time he has to take the life of another living thing when he is asked to shoot the wounded horse. So it says he had never squeezed the trigger against a living thing in his whole life. And again, this is a moment where his brain starts stammering. He can't quite understand what he's supposed to be doing. So this kind of is reminiscent of that scene in the Lousetown brothel, where once again we see Robert confronted with something that he has difficulty grasping. He can't understand what he's supposed to be doing, and here his confusion is sort of related to the fact that, you know, for our Robert, animals are, you know, your friends, right? They're who he's taking care of, and here he is forced to shoot and kill a horse. It's described on the middle of page 57. He must have killed 100 times or more men, or no, he's asked about the battery sergeant major, Joyce, why doesn't he do this? His brain is stammering. He says, Battery Sergeant Joyce, why doesn't he do this? He must have killed 100 times or more men and rats and horses, whatever it was you killed in wars. Robert's brain began its stammering. So he doesn't want to do the shooting himself. He wants the battery sergeant, to do this act. And in this moment, he's confused at what is killed in war, right? He says men and rats and horses, they're all jumbled together to Robert. They're all living things to him. They all sort of have value and integrity and spirit. So he can't quite fully grasp what he's supposed to be doing. And then we get the description of Robert's forced to sort of shoot this horse. And he refers back to, again, one of those childhood books where he remembers a story, seeing something in Chums, which would have been like a boys' annual kind of narrative, where he saw a cowboy shooting a horse behind the ear. So Robert tries to again emulate this vision of masculinity that he's been taught, and he tries firing, but he fails. So he just causes a commotion and all this noise, and then it's again a sort of nightmarish scene where he has to keep shooting the horse until it's dead. It's another traumatic moment in Robert's life. His innocence is destroyed again. He's, you know, experienced death for the first time at his own hands. So this is the first death since Rowena's death, I guess, since where he's faced with mortality. And first the horse was not dead, and then he keeps shooting it. Robert sank to his knees. His knees were wet, and he drew himself into a ball and pushed with all his strength. He began to squeeze the trigger, and he squeezed it again and again and again, so many times that when the sergeant major pulled him away, the gun went on clicking in his hands. Then all hell broke loose. The dead horse quivered beside him, and all the other horses reared back and pulled against their cables. Robert was left alone with the pounding of the sound, and it went around and around the hull like an endless ringing down an iron rail, while the horses rose and fell like rocking horses in a crazy nursery, till Robert kicked his hat through the straw and walked away. So this moment is Robert's first time killing a living creature, and again, it's described very traumatically. It did not go smoothly. It's not as easy as he had read about in his, you know, Boys Annual or Chums, whatever those books are called. It was not an easy thing for him to do, and it's obvious that he is kind of haunted by this moment, and it becomes a kind of nightmare scene where he has to kill something that he has learned to love and take care of.